The story of Genghis Khan begins not with glory, but with betrayal and blood. In the year 1162, on the harsh steppes of Mongolia, a boy was born clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist. The shamans saw this as an omen, a sign that this child would become a great warrior. His father, Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, named him Temüjin after a Tatar warrior he had recently captured in battle. The Mongolian steppes were a brutal place, where survival meant constant vigilance and strength. Tribes warred endlessly over grazing lands, horses, and honor. Alliances shifted like the wind, and blood feuds could span generations. Into this world of violence and uncertainty, Temüjin entered, unaware that he would one day unite these warring tribes and create the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. When Temüjin was only 9 years old, his father arranged a marriage alliance with a girl named Borte from the Conqueror tribe. This was common practice among the Mongol nobility, cementing bonds between clans through matrimony. Yesugei left young Temüjin with Borte's family to serve them until he came of age, as was customary. On his journey home, Yesugei stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars. The Tatars, recognizing him as an enemy who had killed many of their warriors, poisoned his food. Yesugei made it back to his camp, but died shortly after, leaving his family vulnerable and alone. The death of Yesugei shattered Temüjin's world. Without a strong leader, the Borjigin clan abandoned Yesugei's widow, Hoilun, and her children, fearing they would be a burden during the harsh winter months. Hoilun refused to surrender to despair. She gathered her children and taught them to survive on the frozen steppes, digging for roots, fishing in icy streams, and hunting small game. They lived as outcasts, constantly moving to avoid rival clans who might kill them to prevent future revenge. During these years of hardship, Temüjin's character was forged. He learned that loyalty was more valuable than gold, that survival required both cunning and courage, and that the world showed no mercy to the weak. One incident from his youth reveals the darkness that would later make him feared across continents. Temüjin and his half-brother Bektar constantly quarreled over food and resources. When Bektar stole a fish and a bird that Temüjin had caught, the young boy's rage boiled over. Together with his full brother Khazar, Temüjin stalked Bektar across the steppes and shot him with arrows, killing him in cold blood. Their mother Hoilun was horrified, but the deed was done. Temüjin had learned that sometimes survival demanded ruthless action. As Temüjin grew into a young man, his reputation began to spread. He was tall and strong, with fierce eyes that seemed to pierce through men's souls. Around 1178, he returned to claim his bride Borte, and her family welcomed the union despite his poverty. Borte's dowry included a magnificent black sable coat, which Temüjin presented to Togrul, the Khan of the Keret tribe and his father's former ally. This gift was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Togrul, moved by the gesture and remembering his bond with Yesugei, agreed to become Temüjin's patron and protector. But happiness on the steppes was always fleeting. Shortly after his marriage, a rival clan called the Merkits raided Temüjin's camp in revenge for an old grievance. Yesugei had once stolen Hoilun from a Merkit warrior, and now they came to balance the scales. The raiders descended in the night, and in the chaos, Temüjin fled to the mountains while Borte was captured and given to a Merkit warrior as a wife. The shame and rage Temüjin felt burned like fire in his chest. He had failed to protect his wife, and his honor demanded vengeance. Temüjin sought help from Togrul and from Jamuka, his childhood friend and blood brother. Together they assembled a force of 20,000 warriors and struck the Merkits with devastating fury. The Mongols found the Merkit camp and slaughtered them without mercy. Temüjin personally led the charge, cutting through enemy warriors as he searched for Borte. When he finally found her, they embraced with tears streaming down their faces. But Borte was pregnant, and when she gave birth to a son named Jochi, whispers spread about whether the child was truly Temüjin's. Despite the rumors, Temüjin accepted Jochi as his firstborn, though the question would haunt the family for decades. The rescue of Borte marked Temüjin's emergence as a leader of consequence. Warriors began to flock to his banner, drawn by his charisma, his generosity with plunder, and his reputation for loyalty to those who served him faithfully. Unlike traditional Mongol leaders who relied solely on blood ties and hereditary privilege, Temüjin promoted men based on merit and ability. He rewarded loyalty and competence regardless of a man's birth, creating a meritocracy that would become one of his greatest strengths. For several years, Temüjin and Jamuka rode together as allies, their combined forces growing ever stronger. But cracks began to appear in their friendship. They had different visions for how the Mongol tribes should be organized and led. Jamuka represented the old aristocratic order, where power flowed through ancient bloodlines and traditional clan structures. Temüjin envisioned something new, a unified people bound by loyalty to a single leader rather than divided by ancient tribal rivalries. The break came around 1187, when Jamuka was elected as Khan by a coalition of tribes who feared Temüjin's growing power. What followed was years of intermittent warfare between former brothers. Temüjin suffered defeats and victories, each battle teaching him valuable lessons about warfare, loyalty, and the nature of power. After one defeat, many of his followers abandoned him, reducing his force to just a handful of loyal companions. It was during these dark times that Temüjin's true character shone through. Rather than despair, he analyzed his mistakes, adapted his tactics, and slowly rebuilt his power. Temüjin revolutionized Mongol warfare with innovations that would terrify the world. He organized his army into units of 10, 100,000, and 10,000, with clear chains of command. This decimal system allowed for unprecedented coordination on the battlefield. He emphasized discipline, training his warriors to move as one, to execute complex maneuvers, and to follow orders without question. Mongol riders could fire arrows accurately while galloping at full speed, reload while controlling their horses with their legs, and fight for days on end, sustained by dried meat and mare's milk. Intelligence gathering became another of Temüjin's obsessions. Before attacking an enemy, he sent scouts to learn everything possible about their strengths, weaknesses, leadership, and internal divisions. He employed spies, merchants, and traders to gather information from distant lands. This intelligence allowed him to exploit weaknesses, turn enemies against each other, and strike with devastating precision. Psychological warfare became one of his most effective weapons. Temüjin understood that fear could defeat an army before battle was even joined. He deliberately cultivated a reputation for merciless brutality toward those who resisted, while showing unexpected mercy and generosity to those who surrendered without fighting. Cities that opened their gates might be spared entirely, with their inhabitants and property protected. Cities that resisted faced annihilation, with every man, woman, and child put to the sword as an example to others. This calculated terror meant that many cities surrendered at the mere approach of his armies. By 1206, after decades of warfare and political maneuvering, Temüjin had defeated or absorbed all rival Mongol tribes. A great assembly called a Kurultai was convened at the source of the Onan River, where representatives from across the steppes gathered. There, before thousands of warriors, shamans, and chieftains, Temüjin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler or oceanic ruler. He was approximately 44 years old, and he had unified the Mongol tribes for the first time in their history. But Genghis Khan did not merely conquer, he transformed. He implemented a legal code called the Yasa that applied to all Mongols regardless of tribe or status. This code promoted religious tolerance, protected trade and merchants, outlawed theft and adultery, and established harsh punishments for betrayal and desertion. He broke the power of the old tribal aristocracy, redistributing people and resources based on loyalty rather than bloodline. He created a written script for the Mongolian language, recognizing that administration of an empire required records and communication beyond oral tradition. The newly unified Mongol nation needed expansion to survive. The steppes alone could not support the growing population and the warrior culture that had been created. Genghis Khan first turned his attention to the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia, which controlled vital trade routes along the Silk Road. The Tanguts were a sophisticated civilization with walled cities, advanced irrigation systems, and a large standing army. They viewed the Mongols as barbarians who could be easily defeated. The Mongol invasion of Western Xia in 1209 showcased their evolving military capabilities. When faced with fortified cities, Genghis Khan adapted, forcing captured engineers and soldiers to teach his armies siege warfare techniques. The Mongols learned to build siege towers, catapults, and battering rams. They diverted rivers to flood cities or to cut off water supplies. They drove captured civilians before their armies to fill moats and absorb arrows. After several years of campaigning, Western Xia submitted and became a vassal state, providing tribute and troops for future Mongol conquests. Next came the Jin dynasty of northern China, one of the most powerful empires in the world. The Jin had once dominated the Mongols, forcing them to pay tribute and occasionally conducting raids to prevent them from growing too strong. Genghis Khan remembered these humiliations and harbored a deep desire for revenge. In 1211, he launched an invasion with an army estimated at over 100,000 warriors. The Jin Empire had millions of subjects, vast wealth, sophisticated military technology, and heavily fortified cities. By all conventional calculations, they should have crushed the Mongol invaders. But Genghis Khan exploited every weakness in the Jin state. He incited rebellions among subject peoples who chafed under Jin rule. He employed captured Chinese engineers who taught his forces advanced siege techniques. He used the mobility of his cavalry to strike where the enemy was weakest, to ambush reinforcements, and to devastate the countryside, destroying the economic foundation of Jin power. The siege of Beijing, then called Zhongdu, demonstrated the evolution of Mongol warfare. The city's massive walls and determined defenders held out for years. Genghis Khan surrounded the city, cutting off all supplies and reinforcements. Starvation and disease ravaged the population. When sections of wall were breached by siege engines, Mongol warriors poured through, showing no mercy to those who had resisted for so long. The city burned for weeks, and countless treasures were looted. The Jin dynasty never recovered from this catastrophic blow, though it would take decades for the Mongols to complete the conquest of northern China. While campaigning in China, Genghis Khan received an insult that would redirect his attention westward and bring devastation to an entirely different civilization. The Khwarazmian Empire stretched across Central Asia, encompassing modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was ruled by Shah Muhammad II, a proud and ambitious leader who commanded vast armies and controlled some of the world's wealthiest cities. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan of hundreds of merchants to establish commercial relations with the Khwarazmian Empire. When the caravan reached the border city of Otrar, the governor accused the merchants of being spies and had them executed, seizing their valuable goods. Genghis Khan, who highly valued trade and the safety of merchants, sent ambassadors demanding that the governor be punished and compensation be paid. Shah Muhammad, either through arrogance or miscalculation, had the chief ambassador killed and the beards of the others burned before sending them back. This was an unforgivable insult. Genghis Khan assembled a massive army, estimated between 150,000 and 200,000 warriors, and prepared to unleash destruction unlike anything Central Asia had ever witnessed. He left capable generals to continue the war in China, and personally led his forces westward in 1219. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire became legendary for its speed, coordination, and sheer destructive power. Genghis Khan divided his forces into several armies that advanced along different routes, confusing and overwhelming the enemy. His generals Zhibi and Subutai, two of the greatest military commanders in history, led diversionary attacks that drew enemy forces away from the main thrusts. The great cities of Central Asia fell one after another. Bukhara, one of the intellectual and cultural centers of the Islamic world, was captured after its garrison attempted to break out and was annihilated. Genghis Khan reportedly rode into the great mosque and declared to the assembled people that he was the flail of God, sent to punish them for their sins. The city was thoroughly looted, and many of its inhabitants were enslaved or killed. Samarkand, another jewel of Central Asian civilization, fell after a brief siege when internal betrayals opened the gates. The Mongols systematically demolished the city's defenses and massacred much of the population. Artisans and skilled craftsmen were spared and sent back to Mongolia, where their skills would serve the empire. This became standard practice, preserving valuable human resources while eliminating potential resistance. The most horrific destruction came at the cities that resisted longest. Urgench, the capital of Khwarazm, held out for months, its defenders fighting street by street with desperate courage. When the city finally fell, the Mongols diverted the Amu Darya River to flood what remained, literally wiping the city from the map. At Nishapur, where a Mongol prince had been key, led during the siege, the inhabitants were systematically slaughtered in revenge. According to some accounts, the skulls of men, women, and children were piled into separate pyramids as a warning to others. While such accounts may be exaggerated, they reflect the terror the Mongol invasions inspired. Shah Muhammad fled before the Mongol advance, his empire collapsing around him. Genghis Khan sent Subutai and Jebe with 20,000 riders in pursuit. These two generals conducted one of history's most remarkable military campaigns, chasing the Shah across Persia and beyond. Muhammad eventually died on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and defeated. His son Jalal ad-Din continued the resistance with remarkable courage and skill, winning several battles against Mongol forces, but he could not stop the inevitable. Genghis Khan personally defeated Jalal ad-Din at the Battle of the Indus River in 1221, though the prince escaped to fight another day. Meanwhile, Subutai and Jebe, having completed their pursuit of Shah Muhammad, did not return directly to Mongolia. Instead, they requested permission to continue westward on a great reconnaissance expedition. Genghis Khan agreed, and these two generals led their 20,000 riders around the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus Mountains, and into the steppes of Russia. They defeated every army sent against them, including forces from Georgia, the Cumans, and a coalition of Russian princes at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. After 3 years and covering over 8,000 miles, they returned to report to Genghis Khan, bringing detailed intelligence about lands that the Mongols would conquer a generation later. The invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire was not just a military campaign, but an act of calculated destruction. Genghis Khan wanted to send a message to the entire world, insulting or harming the Mongol Empire and its interests brought total annihilation. The economic and cultural devastation was staggering. Irrigation systems that had been maintained for centuries were destroyed, turning fertile lands into deserts. Libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts were burned. Cities that had flourished for 1,000 years were reduced to ruins. The population of Central Asia may have declined by millions, though exact figures are impossible to determine. Yet Genghis Khan was more than just a destroyer. As his empire expanded, he implemented administrative systems that brought stability and prosperity to conquered regions. The Silk Road, which had been fragmented by competing states and plagued by bandits, became safer than it had been in centuries under Mongol protection. Merchants could travel from Europe to China with relatively little danger, leading to an explosion of trade and cultural exchange. This period of relative peace and security across Eurasia became known as the Pax Mongolica. Religious tolerance was one of the surprising aspects of Mongol rule. Genghis Khan himself followed the shamanistic traditions of the steppes, but showed remarkable openness to other faiths. He exempted religious leaders from taxation, engaged in philosophical discussions with Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Christian priests, and allowed his subjects to practice their religions freely. This tolerance was partly pragmatic, as suppressing religion would have sparked rebellions, but it also reflected a genuine curiosity about different belief systems and a recognition that religious persecution was counterproductive. The organization of the Mongol Empire showcased Genghis Khan's administrative genius. He established a courier system called the Yam, with postal stations every 25 to 30 miles across the empire. Messages and officials could travel with incredible speed, allowing the central government to maintain control over vast distances. He standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade. He created a written law code that applied equally to all subjects. He promoted based on merit rather than aristocratic birth, creating social mobility unprecedented in medieval societies. As Genghis Khan aged, he began to consider his legacy and succession. He had 4 sons by his principal wife Borte, along with many other children by his other wives and consorts. The question of which son would inherit his empire became increasingly urgent. His eldest son Jochi remained under a cloud of suspicion regarding his paternity, creating tension with his brothers. His second son, Chagatai, was a fierce warrior but hot-tempered and rigid. His third son, Ogede, was more diplomatic and balanced. His youngest son, Tolui, was brilliant, but perhaps too given to drink. In 1226, Genghis Khan launched his final campaign against the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia, which had failed to provide promised military support for his wars in Central Asia. During this campaign, he fell from his horse while hunting, suffering internal injuries. His health deteriorated rapidly, but he refused to halt the campaign. He wanted to see the Tanguts punished for their betrayal. From his deathbed, he directed the final operations, ordering that the Tangut royal family be exterminated and their kingdom devastated, as an example of what happened to those who broke faith with the Mongols. Genghis Khan died in August 1227 at the age of approximately 65, though his exact birth year remains uncertain. As he lay dying, he designated his son Ogede as his successor, believing him to have the best temperament for holding the empire together. He also left strategic instructions for the continued conquest of the Jin dynasty and plans for future campaigns westward into Europe. The funeral of Genghis Khan was conducted with great secrecy. His body was taken back to Mongolia, and according to tradition, everyone who saw the funeral procession was killed to keep the burial site secret. The location of his tomb remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Various legends claim it lies near his birthplace, possibly near the Burkhan Khaldun mountain that he considered sacred. Over the centuries, numerous expeditions have searched for the tomb, but none have succeeded. Some believe that thousands of horses were driven over the burial site to obliterate all traces, while others think his followers diverted a river to flow over the grave. The empire Genghis Khan created did not die with him but continued to expand for another 50 years. His son Ogede became the great Khan and oversaw the conquest of Korea, the completion of the Jin dynasty's destruction, and the first Mongol invasions of Europe. His grandson Mongke continued the expansion, and his grandson Kublai eventually conquered all of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty. At its greatest extent around 1279, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to India, encompassing approximately 24 million square kilometers and ruling over 100 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's population. The military legacy of Genghis Khan revolutionized warfare. His emphasis on mobility, discipline, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare influenced military thinking for centuries. His use of coordinated operations across vast distances presaged modern combined arms tactics. His integration of siege warfare techniques from conquered peoples showed remarkable adaptability. His creation of a professional officer corps, based on merit rather than birth, created military efficiency that overwhelmed larger but more rigid opponents. The administrative and legal innovations of the Mongol Empire had lasting impacts. The religious tolerance practiced under Mongol rule allowed for unprecedented cultural exchange between East and West. Chinese technology, like gunpowder and printing, spread to Europe along Mongol-protected trade routes. Persian and Islamic science and mathematics flowed into China. The movement of people, ideas, and goods during the Pax Mongolica helped end the medieval period's isolation and laid groundwork for the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. Yet the human cost of Genghis Khan's conquests was staggering. Modern historians estimate that 40 million people may have died as a result of the Mongol invasions, though exact figures are impossible to determine. Entire civilizations were devastated. The irrigation systems of Central Asia built over millennia were destroyed and have never been fully restored. Libraries containing irreplaceable knowledge were burned. Artistic and architectural treasures were lost forever. The population of some regions did not recover to pre-Mongol levels for centuries. The question of how to judge Genghis Khan remains controversial. To his victims, he was a genocidal monster who brought unprecedented suffering and destruction. To his followers and subjects, he was a unifying leader who brought law, order, and prosperity to previously warring peoples. To historians, he was a complex figure whose military genius and administrative innovations shaped world history, even as his conquests brought terrible suffering. What made Genghis Khan extraordinary was not just his military victories, but his ability to transform himself and his people. He rose from the son of a murdered chieftain, abandoned on the steppes, to ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in history. He transformed the Mongols from scattered tribes, constantly warring amongst themselves, into a unified nation with sophisticated administration, written laws, and a meritocratic military. He created systems of governance, communication, and trade that outlasted his lifetime and influenced the development of nations across Eurasia. His legacy remains visible today. The Mongol Empire, despite its eventual fragmentation, created lasting connections between East and West that reshaped human civilization. Modern genetic studies suggest that approximately 16 million men alive today carry Y chromosome lineages traced back to Genghis Khan and his close male relatives, making him one of the most prolific patriarchs in human history. The borders of modern nations from Russia to China were influenced by Mongol conquests and administrative divisions. Legal concepts of international diplomacy and protection of trade developed during the Mongol period. The very idea that a single political entity could span from the Pacific to the Mediterranean influenced later empire builders from Tamerlane to the Ottomans. Genghis Khan died believing he was executing the will of heaven, that he had been chosen to unite the peoples of the earth under Mongol rule. Whether that belief was divine mission or supreme arrogance, he came closer to achieving world domination than perhaps any other individual in history. He transformed warfare, governance, and the patterns of human civilization. The boy born clutching a blood clot, abandoned as a child, hunted and despised, rose to become a name that still echoes through history 8 centuries lat. Inspiring fear, admiration, and endless fascination with the man who conquered the world.